This is a production of Cornell University.
Welcome to Masters Week that has been delayed. I think we've got a weather delay till what, like 10:30, Carl? 40-mile-an-hour winds, going to have trees blowing down on people again. Ooh, that's not looking good.
No.
Okay, so and we're going to welcome Dan Schied, the director of grounds here at Cornell, in a second. As you know, I always have a couple of pictures that sort of set the stage for the goofiness of the industry and work that we do sometimes. And this is really happening. You know, we see pretty much fleets of these things showing up on golf courses on Twitter at least once a week now, I bet, Carl. We're seeing this out there once a week. And I know there's a lot of fear. You know, is it going to take my job? I got into this business for mowing grass. Now I can't mow grass anymore. And all I got to say is pretty soon the animals are going to need representation. We don't seem to be threatened. Last week we had a dog on a skin operator. Now we got the dogs rolling green. So I don't know why we're worried about automation, Carl, when honestly the animals are going to take us over. Happy Lawn Care Month, everybody. April is, in fact, Lawn Care Month, which is sort of one of the many goofy things we do with months. And call things all the time. So Lawn Care Month. And in honor of Lawn Care Month, I thought I'd draw your attention to an approach we're going to talk more about today with Carl, especially in his little rant and update, BMP update too, I guess we could call it. But thinking about a lawn as something different than what the American lawn has been inculcated, how we've been cultured to think the American lawn needs to look. And the Outdoor Power Equipment Institute has the Turf Mutt Foundation. And at this foundation, you can find a number of really nice posters that talk about the value and benefits of the landscape beyond how they look, right? And we talk about this all the time. Now, in case you're wondering, the OPEI, the Outdoor Power Equipment Industry that funds the Turf Mutt Foundation, as you can see, is leaders in the equipment industry, right? So just as you look at these things, certainly we believe it's important to talk about these things in a different way. And I think one of the things we noticed, right, Carl, we heard on the call this morning that lesser celandine, one of these spring ephemerals that generally can dominate a lawn area, is out and about. And so I thought you had something to say about maybe doing this more intentionally with your yard.
Yeah, and maybe even sort of a primer on No Mow May, right, Frank? And so every once in a while we get questions from listeners. So Will sent this question to me last week or a couple of weeks ago, which basically is to this idea, right? If we don't need the turf, if the turf isn't functional, and we want to do something else with that turf, maybe we want to make it a pollinator habitat, or in this case, hey, how do we transition to a meadow? We've done that at Cornell, and our guest today, Dan and I have worked at Cornell to really figure out, okay, we approached it from, okay, we can reduce our carbon emissions, right? That was sort of our main goal, and we did some estimations there. And essentially what happens is instead of mowing these areas 25 times a year, you mow them once per year, right? These meadow areas get mowed down usually sometime in the fall. And Dan, when he came here to Cornell, you got almost 35 acres of this across the campus. And now we're including some of this at the golf course as well. So reestablishment of meadows out there. We got 35 acres of this stuff across campus. You know, how much does that reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? So we did some just sort of, it's not super hard math. How much gas difference is there? 25 mows versus once per year. It's about 4.5 metric tons. That number doesn't mean anything to anybody. So what does that mean in sort of equivalence? That's basically the same amount of carbon that 5 acres of forest can sequester a year. So when you think about why would I want to do this sort of meadow thing? Hey, we can save a lot on gas and a lot on our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, one of the other reasons why you may want to do a meadow, we call these co-benefits, things like biodiversity, plant biodiversity, right? The picture people can see here is a meadow area, and there's a lot of different plants, right? Many more plants, a larger diversity and variety of plants than we would have in a normal turfgrass system mowed at 3 inches every week or 2 weeks, right? These areas are also great for runoff and erosion control. So especially on steep slopes, which I'll talk about in a minute, but slowing that water down, letting it infiltrate into the soil helps recharge our groundwater and stops it from, screaming out onto the pavement, going into a sewer pipe, and then it's in a pipe, and then it's going really fast. And what we don't want water to do is go really fast. We'd like to slow it down and infiltrate into the soil. So another good reason to do meadows. And then the aesthetics. And Dan's done a really good job of communicating this on campus. what these areas are going to look like. They add texture. I sort of like that. A lot of landscape architects will like that sort of different vegetation height. If you've got flowering plants in there, that can look really nice. Frank, you've played around with this at Greenwood to try and get that aesthetic right, especially in a cemetery setting where people are visiting their loved ones. And if you get it right, it looks really great, right? So you get the pictures here of Live Slope, probably the most iconic place on Cornell's campus. And one of the reasons Live Slope is a great candidate is because A, these steep slopes are low traffic areas, right? So we don't need turf grass for people walking around. It's dangerous for them to walk around. Hey, let's make a meadow. Also, it's dangerous to mow those areas as an operator, right? So instead of mowing that 25 times a year, hey, let's only do it once. And we also help operator safety. And then away from buildings would be another, sort of where meadow. Where should I do these? Away from buildings, just because you're going to have a little more animals, mice or something that might get into foundations. Just make sure you're sort of doing it away from those. So why meadow, where meadow, and then how, right? To get to Will's question, well, how do you do it? Sometimes it's just as easy, like what you've done, Dan, is just, hey, let it grow up for a year, mow it down in the fall. Let's see what happens, right? And a lot of places on campus, you found transitioned really well. They may be high density in the first couple of years because it's turf grass, right? There's a high density of turf grass plants in there, but 1 or 2 years in, because of the reduced mowing, you're going to lower that density. And over time, you may get these beautiful sort of meadow areas without even doing anything other than mowing. Now, this doesn't always happen. You might get invasive sort of weeds or woody plants in there. Sometimes, or your density is too great and you just can't get it down. Maybe additional mowings in there can help control either those invasives, or maybe you try and thin it out at certain points during the year with timing those mowings. Mike Hadley does this at Bethpage, right? Frankie's always trying to time the mowing to get it to look like the seed heads to come up at a certain time to get the density right. So you can play around with that. But if you do have a rich soil where water's going to hold, if it's a flat area, those are the places we found it's the most difficult to convert to meadows. You're going to have high density. You may have high weed pressure, right? The weed seed bank is such that, man, it's really hard to just mow it and get something out of it. That's maybe, if you really want a meadow there, that's maybe where you have to start thinking about selective herbicides or even plant growth regulators. Maybe even, Frank, milling the soil off. If that soil's too rich, hey, maybe let's get to the subsoil and plant a pollinator mix in there. And that gets the second part of Will's question, which is, hey, if I want to do, pollinator habitat in these meadows, what plants are best for that? So I did a little looking around, and I found this Xerxes website where it's got a whole, couple pages of tables with plants and sort of when they bloom during the year and how valuable they are for pollinators. So you can take a look at this table. Actually, the first one you see there, red maple, is coming out right now. That's obviously a tree, but that's great for pollinators. We're just hearing from Jen Lerner this morning about sort of how valuable that is in the landscape. So if you're worried about specific plants, I'd sort of point you to this resource. And then when you're looking at the bloom times, the important part is if you want foraging resources year round, make sure you're getting plants that have different bloom types, sort of staggering those. Some March through April, some, June, July, and have sort of that staggered throughout the year. So they always have sort of a food source to go there.
And that would be the gold standard, right? To try to have something that's a real resource. Now, Dan, we'll talk about this just for a little bit with you because we got other things to chat about with you. But in this area, yours has been really just a one mow a year, really not much other planting stuff. Right now, it's sort of stabilized into a look, and everybody knows the signs: tall grass, small gas. You haven't gone to the point of putting other plants in. So just talk a little bit about how it's just evolved for you.
Well, actually, the process started before I came to Cornell, kind of in the 2008-9 cost reduction. And we've just been expanding it to other sloped areas. And so, and it can be very attractive. I mean, I can show you a 1 year photo of just an area at our bee lab that we just allowed to grow, and we mow paths through it, and the seed heads are just spectacular. So it does take time, as Carl said. I actually prefer the seed head look, blowing in the breeze, wintertime, and all that kind of stuff. So so anyway, that's so
it is important. But in your case, it's one mow a year, and when do you do it?
We start because we have a lot of areas, a lot of them are sloped. We have robotic, control
Remote control.
mowers, remote controlled mowers, because of the slopes are pretty steep. And it takes us a while to get through them. So, we start in August, right before the students come back, and go through September.
Okay.
Might be finishing up
All right,
some in October, but once a year.
So let me get through the weather a little bit, and then we'll get to the very interesting part of our conversation today. Not what everybody thinks sometimes you're going to talk about when it comes to grass. So here is what the soils were like last week, right? We were barely creeping into the 50s, and now you can see just yesterday we're starting to creep into the mid 50s. So last week, you can see how quickly the 2-inch temperature will begin to respond. Last week when we talked, it was sort of cooler to the south and warmer to the north. And this week it's cooler to the east and warmer to the west, right? So it's been warmer, and it's as well been a little bit drier to the west. Whereas our folks along the coast, of course, it gave me great pride to know that it's going to rain on opening day at Fenway Park. That gives me just great satisfaction to know that it rains over there all the time. No offense to my pal Dave Meller, but it's the stinking Red Sox fans. I'm happy to have it rain on their parade. So it's been wet, certainly wet to the east and a little bit drier to the west. Now, again, I've been sort of harping on this runoff tool that we have in our forecast model. And you can see that downstate, at least in the Central Park area, you've got a nice window now where runoff isn't expected from the landscape. But certainly today and tomorrow, you can expect a good amount of rain, but it looks like it's going to be drying out down there. And also, when you go to the runoff model, we have another way of looking at soil temperature. And so you can see how soil temperature is hovering here in the mid 50s now over the next 9 to 10 days, right? You can see it almost approaching 60, but it looks like we really started to heat up the mass, particularly in urban areas, right, where we see things advance sometimes. And it looks like warm and wet conditions are likely to continue in the 8 to 14 day outlook. Art said maybe if he squints, he could see some cooler weather coming beyond the 2 week, but he also said it was going to be perfect viewing for the eclipse, and we had 90% cloud cover, and I love Art. All right, so what about the weather? I just wanted to bring up a point here. Trends I've been seeing where the weather's been so extreme in some parts of the world. This happens to be a picture in England from February, where the associations and the industry of golf is coming out and saying, everybody's complaining about golf. Maybe we should tell everybody, in case they don't notice, the weather's really bad, folks. You know what I mean? And we can't get on the golf course. So Bigga did a big piece. What golfers are asking: why is the golf course closed today? How is this winter impacted? I thought something that was really cool in the Florida the golf magazine. Florida's had a lot of rainy, cloudy weather that we talked about earlier, and now they're saying, well, the greens are rolling really slow. You can look at this article. So here's Golf Magazine writing to golfers saying, here, your complaints are real. The greens are slower, and here's why, in case you don't want to listen to the expert that works at your facility. I thought this was really good because this particular superintendent in Florida was very candid. Particularly down here. At the same time, course operators should understand how El Nino affects budgets. Stressed turf can require extra fertilizer and other applications. Quote, we're spraying more fungicide down here than ever, and they're not cheap, he says. We're also putting down more ropes and stakes to minimize the wear and tear from traffic that doesn't heal. This is what's been happening now. We're being more open and transparent about how the extreme weather conditions are impacting things. Now, talking about weather, last week, I made a nod to, hey, why the grass dies by the sidewalk and later snow sometimes, leads to turf death along, here's our Tower Road in Ithaca from many years ago. And of course, I was, already reminded, hey, It's not this. We're not talking about, trucks or tractors driving over things like this. That does create soil problems and has to be addressed in some way. So no matter how wide you make a sidewalk or how tight you make a corner, you're invariably going to get something like this. But we're talking about chemical damage. And one of our great listeners and pals and NYSTA board member for many years and been a great research cooperator for us, Greg Chorvis down in Saugerties at the Canteen Memorial Stadium and Park, sent a note. Hey, you mentioned treated salt. And by the way, here's the lowdown. We've been using this. It can be expensive, but when you balance that out compared to what you lose, and we just happen to have a local resident who spent most of his career dealing with snow in Rochester, now is down here in Ithaca working with us as the director of grounds. And this is a picture I took just last year from what you can see looks like, when you look closely at this, it looks like it splashes a little bit. And you get right down in there and you see the damage that's occurred there. Now, one of the things we did a few years ago was we went out through the winter and we're collecting plugs at different months of the year. We bring them in and see if they would grow. When we brought them in after a March snow, they didn't regrow. So we went back and looked at our sensor data. We had put sensors at 2-inch depths a foot off the sidewalk where the grass was dying. And when we look at those soil temperatures, you can see that in early March, we're getting to an average daily high of 50 degrees in early March. This was back in 2009 or 10 when we did this work. And you can see between the month of March, you're regularly getting a high temperature into the 50s, which means plants are going to break dormancy, right? The plants right along the sidewalk are going to break dormancy. And then you apply the salt, and invariably you see when you apply the salt, very high soil EC concentrate, right? Electrical conductivity. These are electrical conductivity measurements at 2-inch depth, and it's a proxy for salt content in the soil. Now, when you look at the levels here, that red line is considered where you might want to be concerned for turf. But you'll also notice that in quick order, it drops below that, right? And in high rainfall areas, generally salt will not build up in the soil, and I do not generally recommend gypsum is required. It generally will not, even though you'll see a salty crust, once you start getting water moving through that system, the salts are just going to flush through. And as you know, we don't really have any problem with salt moving through the system. All right, Dan. So here's the information that started the conversation about melting points and salt requirements to melt things. So let's take a minute and go through some slides that you provided. And we'll start with this one. What am I looking at here? I'm looking at temperatures from -6 up to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'm looking at the amount of ice 1 pound of salt will melt, right? So this means I'm looking at something that says 30 degrees, it'll melt almost 50 pounds of salt. At 25 degrees, that it only melts 14 pounds of salt, right? And then you go down to, 5 degrees, it only melts 4 pounds of ice, right? And then you go down to the negative thing and it only melts 3 pounds of ice, but it really jumps right around the freezing point. Let's talk a little bit about the use of, this is sodium chloride for melting ice.
So, I mean, the most striking thing is that the salt loses 2/3 of its effectiveness just at 5 degrees. And,
Okay.
A temperature of 25 is not that uncommon, right? And 30
Right.
with the sun and radiant heat, you may not even need that much salt. So, so that's significant. And what you looked at, what our mutual friend Greg wrote about is additives to the salt, right? That can
Okay,
help.
so here we go. So here's the treated salt slides you sent me, right?
Yep.
Now, here we go, and it's a little darker. Sorry for the picture. You can see on the right-hand side of this road, for those of you watching live, watching the YouTube, you can see it. On the right-hand side of this road, it looks liquefied. And on the left-hand side of this road, it looks like it isn't. And this is at 9 degrees with no sun. And again, here are two slides. One where on the left, it looks liquefied, where the magic treatment was made, and one on the right where the magic treatment wasn't made. Okay, so what Greg says is he treats the salt. It's a molasses-based compound. Talk to us a little bit about how this treated salt thing works. I got a picture of a process here that you can see how it's done. I'm interested in hearing from you. Why are you mixing? Talk a little bit about the concept of treating salt with molasses.
So this right here is making brine. So this is not treating the salt. That's just a brine making thing that we experimented with to see as a pre-treatment or an anti-icing, right? Treatment to create that brine barrier before a snowfall.
Okay, so we'll get rid of that.
Yeah.
And we'll just look at you. Tell me about treated salt that Greg's talking about, that you know about.
So now molasses does melt salt, or, we'll just use the word term melt, even though it doesn't really melt the salt, although calcium chloride, because it's exothermic and gives off heat, it may melt snow, where salt is endothermic, so it needs heat to get into the brine state. So the treatment of with molasses, and if he's using a product called Magic, it would have magnesium chloride in it. So it's molasses and magnesium chloride you treat your salt with. So the molasses does a few things. It's an agricultural byproduct. It coats the salt. It allows you to use a little bit less, because a third of your salt is typically lost through what's called bounce and scatter. Bounces when it hits the road, car tires pop it off before it gets into a brine state, all of that. So a third of your salt is lost, and it creates those issues that you showed the pictures of, only maybe on the curb side, not the sidewalk side, right? You go along, you see curbs are burnt. So the bounce and scatter is a little bit less because it's treated. It's a little gooey. It reduces corrosion on your equipment because the sodium chloride is not coming in contact with your equipment. It's coated.
Okay.
So corrosion goes down significantly, and the magnesium chloride works at lower temperatures. So you don't need as much salt because magnesium chloride works at lower temperatures. It's also hygroscopic and exothermic, so it takes moisture from the air. It doesn't need water, or it doesn't need heat to brine. It takes it creates its own heat, and being exothermic, it takes in the heat, and being hygroscopic, it takes moisture out of the air to form the brine, versus needing heat or friction of car tires or the pavement surface to get it into a liquid state. So all of those factors,
like sodium chloride. All right, this is very good. Because exothermic, endothermic, hygroscopic, we want to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about. Everything is based on sodium chloride, right? We usually use, because they can dig it out underneath the lake 3 miles up the road here, we use sodium chloride. Are you telling me that is, I always thought that did take in moisture, so that's also hygroscopic, right?
it's hygroscopic. It needs liquid to brine. So it requires.
It needs liquid.
Correct.
Okay, so it can't take it from the atmosphere.
Right. Calcium chloride and magnesium chloride are hygroscopic, not hydroscopic.
Okay.
So
when you're
as
go ahead.
As the salt begins to melt or lower the freezing point of ice, as you begin to get liquid, well, then it creates the liquid that it creates more liquid, right? But it needs that initial heat from either sun, pavement surface, or friction of car tires, which is why when you drive down roads, often you see just the paths where the car tires are wet, is because that friction creates some heat, and then will allow the salt to be more effective.
Okay, so there's two parts. So again, when we're talking about minimizing injury, I want to be clear on a couple of things. First off, when you use this molasses magnesium chloride magic thing, one of the things I thought was that maybe you just use magnesium chloride in the later snows. They're expensive. You're telling me that I can use less sodium chloride that's more injurious to lawns. I can use less of it by putting molasses that doesn't make it bounce as much there. And also that magnesium chloride works pretty well and doesn't injure the grass. Is that
It works at
a
lower
true
temperature.
statement?
So the other thing I've been told is that the agricultural byproducts like molasses, beet juice, whatever you use is also start the brining process sooner. So so I was told by the representatives from the company that it's actually, as you're spreading it, it's already brining. So
Okay.
whether or not that's the case, the issue is you use less because you primarily from the physical aspect of not being lost to bounce and scatter. And then secondarily, because the magnesium chloride works at lower temperatures. And so you're melting more than 3 pounds of ice per pound. So the whole process, and these were magic that Greg uses. Clear Lane is a Cargill product that both of them have won the EPA Design for the Environment Award, primarily because they allow us to create safe conditions with less sodium chloride being used.
So when you go and plow, all right, listen, when you go and plow, all right, you put the salt down, now you got slush. When you plow that slop onto my grass, is that still going to kill it?
I would think that there's going to be high sodium content in that slush that you're plowing along the road.
Okay, so this doesn't sound okay. So let's
talk
about
less sodium. There's going to be less sodium chloride though, by a factor of a third.
Okay, so 30% less sodium might mean it injures less. What about cost? Because Greg did a great job in saying, yeah, it might cost more, but I don't have to replace this, that, and the other thing. And I don't want you to get into the gardens and beds because that's not going to be what we're talking about. I'm talking about the grass here. So is it your sense that the cost can balance itself out in a scale of a place like Cornell?
If it's implied correctly, your costs will go down. The Clear Lane that we buy from Cargill has come down significantly. It used to be about 50% more. It's now maybe 20%. So let's do the math here. Let's talk about efficiency. I load my truck up. I can go out and I can do 30 to 40% more area with one trip. So what used to take me 3 trips, I now do in 2. And I'm not driving back all that wasted time back to load up again. So I think you can make a case. Now you're still going to pay your staff for the full day or whatever, but you can make a case that it actually, if it's applied properly, it could be less expensive.
Excellent. And hopefully the plan is less injurious at a time when the plants are very susceptible breaking dormancy. And if there's a way to not splash it so far and not distribute, like you said yesterday, as we wrap up, you said, because the bounce and scatter thing is recognized now as an issue, more guys are lowering their spinner speeds when they're using the stuff because they're compensating and letting the traffic or the bounce distribute the material, not just the winging it like we do top dressing sand.
Right. And, there's shields that go on the back of spreaders that they hit and drop down. And there are various ways to control that. The biggest challenge is, right, and this was true at Rochester when I was there, it's true here. We get a lot of pressure about slip and falls and potential injury and everything else.
Slip and falls.
And you want to, or accidents on the road or whatever. And so you got staff who want to do the right thing. And we live in a world where more is better. We know that that's not the case with fertilizers or whatever. And with these treated products, it is a learning process with your teams. I have 50 people out spreading this stuff to remind them that this stuff works better and so that they gain experience with. So we've moved into that slowly here. And now we're up to, of our 4 bays of salt, 3 of them are Clear Lane and only 1 is rock salt. Primarily because there is something I actually learned at Rochester. And because when you treat the salt with the agricultural byproduct, all the fines get kind of coagulated. we found that when we had a dusting of snow, that just rock salt worked better because the fines brined quicker. So the fines in the rock salt. So if you get a dusting of snow, sometimes we found in our limited experience at Rochester that straight rock salt worked better with a dusting. But as a pre-salt or anti-icing to create that brine barrier so the snow doesn't adhere to the surface, which requires more salt, more trips, more plowing. Getting it down first, getting the treated salts down, give you the magnesium chloride, works lower temperatures, all that stuff.
Okay. All right. Well, Carl, we're at the hour, and all I got to say is we went off the rails today. Meadows and salt brine and exothermic, endothermic. I tell you, you never know what you're going to get on this show in the fastest 30 minutes. Get us out of here.
Yeah, thanks, Sever. Just a quick comment. So a couple questions we had. Dan, I think you just touched a little bit on the terminology of anti-icing, applying something before the snow occurs. Vitas was saying in his community they do beet juice as an anti-icing treatment before the snow falls. Does that make sense?
That's great on roads. I think some of the troubles you have with some of those straight agricultural products on sidewalks is you get close to a building, you get some tracking.
Yeah.
So I think that's a concern on sidewalks near buildings. Greg, I think, said that he uses it on his sidewalk. So I'd be curious to know if he's using just a straight liquid, if he gets tracking, or if he's using a treated salt, which, would have less actual product because it's treating the thing. So I may check with him on that. But the anti-icing is important. Minnesota, a lot of state DOTs have done huge studies on one, like 81, one going north, they anti-ice, the other one they didn't, and they tracked the amount of salt they needed when the other one, when traffic created that bond and that thick matted snow, how much salt they had to use to clear it versus the other one. And it was a factor of 3 or 4 times. I mean, it was significant. So Minnesota, just look those up. Minnesota State DOT did a huge study.
And you mentioned it, Dan, and I'll just jump in here that, this is a contaminant as well. And we got lakes, and they're potentially nitrogen and phosphorus and other things in these salts as well. So I think it is important to keep in mind it's good BMP to use as little as possible in this case. What do you think, Carl?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, the idea that I think we're talking about, I think on email, how magnesium chloride, that's not great. We don't want to use it, but if it reduces our use of the NaCl, the sodium chloride, that's probably a good thing. And when we care about the grass, that's right. We want to.
That's right.
That.
That's right.
So
there we go.
Yep. Thanks.
I just saw
for joining.
A quick question coming, Carl. I'm guessing that pertains to Meadows.
Yeah, there was a tick question about Meadows, and Nancy, I might do a rant on this later, but the idea that Meadows and long grass has more ticks, I think we're learning more about that. Joellen is our expert, Joellen Lampman from the New York State IPM office. So we might have a rant for Nancy on that sometime soon.
Well, I would just say
look out for that.
You don't want to have meadows where people want to traffic, or if there is traffic, then you have to mow a pathway through them.
Wider pathways, right?
You don't want people traversing through that. Any place we've had a spot where people might want to go one side to the other, then you mow pathways.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right.
So yeah, it's a bit of an odd one, Frank, on Masters Thursday to be talking about salt and meadow areas. You won't see any salt or meadow areas over at Augusta. So for those who are going to watch today, have fun doing that. We will see you all next week.
Thanks for sending the questions in. Thanks for sending the questions.
Love the questions. So everybody take care. We'll see you guys next week.
Thanks, Dan.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.